So there's a moment before working on this video, which relies on the reading of certain authors. Think of Nan Shepherd, The Living Mountain, or John Muir writing on glaciers at the Yosemite Valley. So all this idea that the mountain landscape can be understood in some sense as a surface where all the processes taking place there are leaving their traces. So where erosion, sedimentation and the orogenic formation becomes visible. And what is poignant from these texts is how they use within their narrative continuously visual images in a textual form. The photography, so to say, is somehow latent in the ratings, in a way that you are able somehow to see not the landscapes, but the landscape forming processes. That is what's interesting from this specific domain of nature writing. And we were interested in how also the tradition of landscape photography, mountaineering photography, entailed also this idea that images were able to show, to display, to make evident the latent processes that form behind the landscape that are also orogenic in a sense. For us, this means this is involved by this notion, the notion of the surface, so that tensions occur at the level of surface and thus become visible. But there's this, so we think of it as a sort of hinge that allows us to connect this domain of being inside the landscape and being aware of the processes that are taking place in it, and the efforts of making them evident through other media, and how this connects to a story of speculative futures.
Yeah, and this was actually also, I mean, we've spent a fair bit of time over the past 5 years at least, perhaps even longer, on thinking about surfaces with Abelardo, as one does. Particular kinds of surfaces that seem very remote from these surfaces. So we wrote a book called Living Surfaces that is also available here in the Transmediale counter, where we try to do a version of this as well, a version of the sort of an inversion of image and surface, of landscape and image, and the ways in which you can write a really quirky history of environmental images, environmental modeling, environmental thought perhaps, through this pairing of surfaces and images, both in the sense of epistemics of image and then later models as ways of grasping surfaces that are significant for a particular planetary processes of whether it's sometimes described as homeostasis, whether it's sometimes described in very sort of instrumental terms by way of agriculture, history of plantations, and the sort of a semi-scientific, semi-experimental, semi-media history of this pairing as such, which also then sort of offered us a platform to think through the particular image pairings and themes that Abelardo just described as well. So obviously it is separate, it is about particular living surfaces of growth, but it really plays into our interest in questions of light and a very different media history than photography in the sense of pictures of something, but photography as one part of a history of capture of light that also then links to remote sensing and multiple other modalities as well. So that's a short version of the context that we also hope that resonates with your work, Marco, in multiple kinds of ways, especially the sort of ways in which we think about questions of measurement and questions of images and questions of glaciers and those kind of landscapes, right?
Yeah, definitely. I actually brought some images as a sort of not response, but kind of comparison with your images. And in this sense, I think I would like maybe not to step in more on this idea of how something emerges, or like what kind of information can emerge from landscape. So we know that the Earth itself now contains information, and this can be observed and collected and viewed and processed by different kind of proxies. But I think in your work, there's the idea that like reflectance and albedo and the calculation itself happens in the act of observation. It's not something that's there, but only manifests itself to the act of observation. So there's some images that are part of a long research I did on the archive of the Military Geographic Institutes of Italy on the constructions of the border across the Alps. And in particular, the ways in which before remote sensing and area surveying technologies, the only way to measure the distance between mountain peaks was actually to observe the distance between points of reference. And the only way this could be done was by actually modifying, by building this sort of like small architectures, either by cutting sightlines or by constructing the small point of augmentations and peaks so that these points could be measured. And in particular, I always was struck in the archive by these, like the images, for example, here below, in which through just, panoramas of the Alps, that then surveyors, when they were back in the office, they were tracing with their hands and drawing upon these images in order to detect an edge. And that edge, which of course now is made visible by difference in lights, is what became now the watershed line and the border. So it's sort of like a fictional geographic features that could only emerge through a specific point of view and a specific observation with specific light conditions in the landscape. And then we have images like these. These are images from the 1940s, so right after the war, on the kind of the definition of the boundary between Italy and France that was negotiated after the war. And I think this image kind of defines the image itself, the landscape itself, almost as a theater of observation, where you see the surveyor at the center of the portrait, at the center of the image. Us, as viewers of this media, behind the surveyors, we can see what they see, and we see this line calculated and traced over the edge of this mountain. And again, I think this is interesting because it also connects to what we said before about the sort of dichotomy or the contrast between the view from above and the view from the ground. Now, this is a view from the ground, but it produces a line which is, its outcome is a cartographic representation, therefore sort of like media that is meant to be observed by above as a definition. And there's also like, again, in this other image, a sort of an issue of scale. When we see here, we can still recognize some sort of connection between the line itself and the drawing at the edge. While here, when we get very close to the surface, the pretext of like what the light shows us, what the terrain is, completely loses any kind of connection with the tracing of the line. So there are some differences between, and these are some images from your film, which I think connects well to the archival ones. What's the difference between light as form of observation and drawing as a form of act of finding information in the landscape? But it also, maybe this also connects to the work of other practitioners that have been documented this landscape. For example, chemical work of Susan Schuppli, which I think has been like a huge reference for all of us. In her case, she talks about the cryosphere, she talks about finding information in ice cores and the ways in which the Earth itself is a repository of this kind of long-standing climate dynamics. So I wonder, in this sense, what's the kind of aesthetics you were looking after with your movie, and how you feel in relation with the work of these other practitioners on the similar topics?
You want to go first? Well, I can talk a bit and then you can fill in. Right. It is basically the context on the one hand, and we'll talk a bit about this in a moment, but the whole question of, and I really like the fact that you kind of mentioned also that even if we have a reference point in terms of particular photographic collections, 19th century, early 20th century photographic collections that feature the MS Vial, Spelterini and others, that have their own historical context and such, but we were also kind of very aware, and hence the hat tip at the very end to Christopher Hoyer and others who've been working on not just photographic or post-photographic ways of understanding these landscapes and the ways in which, for especially early photography, obviously, glaciers and kind of Arctic or Antarctic becomes image problem. Excess of light in terms of what photography can actually even image in the traditional sense. But that features already not just in photography but in Renaissance, in terms of, like, let's say the sort of like pre-photographic expeditions, sort of a colonial expeditions as such, which encountered the image problem, as Hoyer really wonderfully puts, and trying to kind of make sense of, in this sort of like Western gaze, right, in terms of like how to make an image, there's excess of light, there's no traditional contours, it doesn't look like my jolly good Europe anymore. And that sort of is, of course, the colonial trope that sort of repeats in multiple kind of other instances, like the trope of the desert, as if without people, and that's sort of interesting backdrop. But in terms of contemporary context, we obviously can think of this work as part of questions of temperature, environmental humanities, even ice humanities and such kind of work, and other sort of a video and sort of people who think with images, like Susan Stripley's, which leads us into quite a different context, but a nice sort of a dialogue between the topics that we here seem to talk about more in the register of images and the kind of question of what is this shift, and more on that in a moment as well, shift from cinematics and photography to particular kind of repertoire of quote-unquote AI or synthetic intelligences working with data sets from these, and onto, but then the kind of difference to people like Susan, who's been interested in the question of coldness, right? And that's sort of like somewhere at the back of our head is the implied dialogue with Susan's work, and many of you probably have seen it as well, and we had it in, for instance, in Athens, but also in Gijón at Laboral, when we curated with Daphne Dragona exhibitions of weather engines. We had Susan's cold cases there, which basically document a lot of use of, for instance, coldness as torture in contemporary, and again, very relevant to our times as on the various border practices in the US, for instance. But also the question of right to coldness. In other words, flipping it also to be about the question of who's got the right to cold. In other words, echoing indigenous discourse in terms of warming of the planet and the ways in which preservation of the cryosphere is a human right. And this, of course, comes from indigenous activists in early 21st century, I mean, 20 years ago from that discourse. But we also wanted to say that that's a reference point, even if it doesn't feature in the narrative, so to speak, right? So the kind of body of work emerging at the moment around questions of ice and cold. But you, it's your turn. Go ahead and kind of fulfill points there.
Because we are surrounded by these images, even there are channels, social media, they belong to the circulation of media that we watch. All these snowy mountains, the glaciers, the polar landscapes, with a very particular type of eye. So part of the aesthetics, or part of the research, we wanted to deal with this image substance in a way to understand why are these images appealing us, in a sense, and what types of intensities are circulating through them, when they even belong to the scientific apparatus, such as satellite domain, etc. So for us, in relation to, we had the intuition that Chris Marker would be a reference from an aesthetical point of view, in a sense that, and in particular, so his project La Jetée as a film out of photographies, building something different rather than a set of photographies. That was for us what happens inside that data set. What does it happen when images get into a data set and then are transformed into a model, which is somehow what is happening in these 18 minutes in a speculative way. But we were interested also in this. It is more a personal feeling, I think. When we observe these landscapes, we experience an affective relation with the images. There's a tension, there's a desire even. So there was a desire in the moment of taking these pictures. So photography acted as a visual colonization tool, it was a navigational tool, it was this sort of Google Earth related space of action. Now these images are perhaps not strictly related to this spatial extension of the human Western subject, but they entail also a temporal affective space. When we look at these images, it is difficult not to experience the desire for them to be part of our landscapes again. So looking even at the satellite ones of the polar landscapes with the lines, this is where the next iceberg will emerge. So you have this gesture. I'd like to place here a sort of a scotch tape of sorts in order to glue again this ice together for it not to be melted into the oceans and also into these environments of images. There is this desire that appears very clearly, this space of desire within markers, la jetée, and the loops this desire builds. So the idea, so if we have the images, perhaps we can make something out of them and build anew what these images represented, which in la jetée becomes time travel, going back to those moments and trying to restore things. We know this is not impossible. We know this is part of their fictional space. They might be scientific scientific space of environmental analysis, but it entails also an affective fictional space of movement. And we wanted to face this clash of intensities by acknowledging also so that we are dealing with a different type of visual intensity. So Marker, for instance, highlighted the close-up type of sequence in cinema as a differential, as a key differential aspect technique that distinguished cinema from theater. And in this domain, we find that satellite images are also a very particular devices in order to understand images as radiant fields. So we know these images are usually concerned with land grabbing projects, with mining projects, with extract within the extractive industries, but there are also very interesting latent space of intensities where an unknown radiance part of a non-human dialogue, which in the film is named as albedo, as a simple way of dealing the intensities, the continuous exchange of light between surfaces, between the sun and the earth, which is something pre-human and of course post-human as well. So we wanted to face these tensions, tensions that are embodied within all this imagery that circulates